being here. Appreciate the opportunity to meet again. This is, I'll call the meeting to order and remind us that this is a virtual meeting, which should be obvious to all of us. And it is being live streamed on YouTube. So we want to welcome the members of the public that are participating with us. We introduced ourselves last week, and we're not going to go through that process again, but Simone, I don't believe you had the opportunity to introduce yourself. So if you will tell us who you are and who you represent, uh, then we'll go on from there.
Sure. I was on. I'm not sure why I wasn't coming across, but I am with USD 443 in Dodge City. So I've been in the pretty new to the public school system. I've been here about a year and a half. I was in the private sector for about 30 years before that.
Well, we welcome and appreciate your experience. At this point, you have an agenda. Uh, uh, we won't call the roll. Michaela will just pick it up off the participation list, so we won't go through that process again. But you have a copy of the agenda, and at this point, unless there's an addition or a correction, a motion would be in order to approve the agenda. And it identifies. I see Mike Argabright makes that motion. Is there a second? Jamie, is
This
that
is
your hand? Looks like Mike and Jamie. All in favor, please indicate by raising your hand. All of you that are opposed, raise your hand. And I only saw up hands, so we'll call that good, approved. You have the minutes of February the 26th. Have you had the opportunity to review those? And if so, if there are not, if there are additions or corrections, this is the time to mention that. If not, a motion would be in order to approve.
Move to approve.
And
I'll
who was that?
second.
Okay, Brad, and who seconded it?
Bert Lewis.
Okay, Bert. Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. All opposed, motion carries. And at this time, 8 minutes early, I'm going to turn this over to the commissioner.
Mr. Porter, that puts a lot of pressure, 8 minutes, so make sure we get out at least 8 minutes now earlier.
That's the reason I mentioned it, Commissioner.
I know you did. So I appreciate it. Good to see all of you. Thank you again for volunteering. And Bert, as a reformed social studies teacher, your background does my heart wonderful things on a Friday. And Lisa, Nick wanted me to ask if we saw you drinking a Sonic drink because it's happy hour 2 to 4 in Sonic. And since I didn't see that you took something by for Nick on the way back. So no, he's just joking. I'm picking on Nick. He didn't really do that, but I used to work at the Sonic Drive-In a long time ago when I was about 14 years old. So, all right, we're going to share a lot of things with you. This is a heavy meeting because we're going over the process for EANS in particular, a little bit for ESSER, but next week will be all about ESSER with a little bit of EANS. But today it's all about most of it is about the private school money and EANS. So you should have the PowerPoint. If you don't, well, I'll drop it in the chat for you also. And also you can follow along. Please take notes. We'll stop every about 3 or 4 sections to take a break and also to answer any questions. And you will have lots of questions. And I just need to also tell you that as we speak, the Senate is hearing ESSER 3 and Nick and Janet, what may become EANS 2. And so stay tuned because we think maybe by about midnight, there may be a bill that comes out of the Senate, but we'll discuss that at another time. Today is going to be all about EANS and a little, as I said, a little bit about ESSER 2. So let me do this. I'm going to drop into the chat. It never works just like I want it to, but maybe I'll do that here in a second. Hopefully, though, you have it in front of you. I'll share my screen. And again, please take notes because as you know, Zoom is a little bit hard for me to see if someone has a question. As you get to the question part, again, if you adjust in the chat, write question, Jim will call on you, and then we can try to answer your question. So here we go. Here's what we're going to flow through today. I'm going to recap a little bit of the Eanes Law and the authorized use of the funds. Again, for those of you, as we throw around these acronyms, Eanes is the money allocated for private accredited and non-accredited schools in Kansas. Tate is going to go over the application launch process and timeline. Tate and I will go over that. Tate solo is going to go over all the application questions of how the application will look and flow. I will then give a little bit of that about the review process about Eanes, and then I will also wrap up with the ESSER application timeline and review process. But as you can see, the bulk of this is for our private schools in Kansas today. Again, as we talked about last time, this is a federal list, and what it is subject to are state requirements. And that's what we're here to do as the task force, is provide those state requirements. But the list of how you get the money, excuse me, and you utilize that is from the federal government. We do not have any authority to change that at all. So the very first thing I will always emphasize to you, whether it's the Eanes money or the ESSER money, is that in this case, any non-public school may apply to receive services and assistance to address educational disruptions resulting from COVID-19. Every expenditure must tie back to something that was found or shown or disrupted because of COVID-19. And here again are those possible services or assistance: supplies to clean, personal protective equipment, masks, face shields, improved ventilation systems. And this list always says including windows until you get to what's not included in the law, and it says windows. So I don't know how to reconcile that. We'll let Tate talk maybe about that. Training for cleaning your buildings or doing a better job with your buildings. Physical barriers, so those are those plexiglass shields that we see. Other materials or supplies that you need to reopen buildings or to keep them safe. Administering COVID testing. So if you're doing more testing in order to keep people in school or for activities, I know it's been extremely popular for activities. If you need hotspots, Chromebooks, bandwidth, technology, that can be done. Instructional plans for remote or hybrid. Leasing spaces for social distancing. Transportation costs. This will be really when we think about summer school or extended school year. Transportation costs can be included. And again, one of the big ones, initiating and maintaining support services to assist learning loss. And then reimbursement for any expenses going forward or going backward to March 13th of 2020. Nothing new. Federal law, the federal list of what those things can be used for. Now I'd like to go over some information related to the launch process and timeline, and talk about that on the Eanes application side. First of all, again, I want to for everyone, this becomes complicated, and if there's an Eanes 2 and an ESSER 3, this will become even more complicated, because every time there's a new round of funding, there are slightly different rules attached to it. So Eames, 30 days from the time that a school gets the application, they have to have notice from us that it's been approved or rejected. So we're operating on an extremely tight time frame that we currently understand. And I'm looking at my watch because I show 3:10 and it could change. But I currently understand that Eames 2 may not, I want to emphasize that, may not have quite as tight time constraints. ESSER, the schools have 1 year. That's not fair. It just, and everyone's going to say, why did the task force do this or why did we do this? We didn't do it. It's the way the law was written between the two. Allocation of funds is different. There's this almost 27 million going to Eames that will be distributed, possibly in its entirety, to schools that apply for it. On the public school side, on the ESSER side, that money's already been allocated to schools. They just have to tell you how they want to use it. So it's different. We're guessing on the Eames side that we might give 150 to 300,000 per school. Why is that a guess? We don't know how many schools will apply and we don't know what the needs will be. That's kind of a guess looking at what we know of the private accredited and the private non-accredited schools. And that's just a guess. The ESSER average is 1.15 million per district. Now that can range a great deal. And so obviously Brad and Goodland is going to look at that and say, that may be low or high as we would in Spring Hill or in Fredonia. So it can range from just a few $1,000s to several tens of millions. For our purposes, we're trying to look at an assessment of requests to prioritize the allocation of the Eames money. And it is a difficult task, more difficult than on the ESSER side, where we're just trying to evaluate the local school district's plans on how they're going to spend it. We have to do both an assessment, we have to look at poverty, and then we have to do on the private school side whether to allocate those resources.
Let's pause just a second. I believe Nick has a question.
Yes.
Is that you, Nick? Salina Catholic Schools?
Okay, yes, a little bit on the timeline. The PPP program had a halt between, had a halt. Some schools cannot apply until 2 weeks. I just want to ask the question again. If they apply and do not receive PPP funds, then they can apply for Ames, right?
Nick, I believe that is correct, but I'm going to turn to our behind the scene experts, Tate and maybe our BCG group to give that answer. Tate, I'm going to start with you. That is correct, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. As long as they can meet the deadlines for our Eames last day. So if they're 2 weeks from now, they should have some time, but it's going to be a tight turnaround.
Okay, Tate, but if they don't qualify, but they miss the deadlines for us, they're out of luck. Is that true?
Probably. And I only say probably because if we don't have the request or we don't allocate all the funds for services, we may have an option for a second round, but we don't want to encourage people to take that chance because there might not be funds available.
Okay. Should we give guidance to the private schools that if they're thinking about applying for PPP funds, to go ahead and go ahead with the Ames process, and if they did get the funds, they would be dropped out rather than losing out on both ends?
Yeah, we would be perfectly fine with that first option to go ahead. They can apply, but we really need to know as soon as possible if they receive the PPP so we can drop their funding from this and award it to other places, but that would be fine.
Okay. So my other question that goes along with that, because we're finding out more schools are now thinking about PPP over Ames, and that would change the allocation to the other schools, would it not?
Yes. And one thing we need to remind people of is if they do it this way, there is an assurance on the EANS that they are not going to accept, that they're not going to participate in PPP. So they would need to let us know immediately because it's going to affect them more than us because they could get into a lot of trouble and lose the ability to get those funds.
One more question and I'll let you go. Would a suggestion anyway, would it be helpful to add on the application, have you applied for PPP funds? So we would know that is a possibility that they would not be using it. Just a suggestion. I'm not
Yep.
asking you.
We'll think about because there's a lot of ways. That's one way. But yes, thank you. And feel free to remind us of these things.
Excellent suggestions. And I think the first part, Nick, yes, please encourage them to apply because we want to make sure they get some funding, right? We can always drop out of the EANS, but we don't want them to miss that window. And so those are really good questions. This time frame I'm going to walk through because it can look a little confusing. It's, you know, a nice a weak look here, but I want to start with this. This is what we have to back into for the EANS money, which makes this window so tight. On the 13th and 14th, the State Board of Education will approve the EANS task force recommendations. So they will look at those applications that have been there. So that's what we're trying to hit. Because if we don't, the state board doesn't meet again till May, and that would be too late for them to take action as required by law. So today, as you see, we're discussing this information. We're on Friday. And on Monday, we will pre-launch the application to all private schools. I'll go over that more in detail, what will happen next week. Tentatively scheduled, the launch would happen officially on the next Monday, the 15th. Now, I know Janet and Nick were extremely concerned about this, as we are. And so when we get into it, Tate may talk about later on what we might be able to do to give this out a few days earlier. But let me continue to walk through this. The EANS deadline then is the 26th, and that's so that our staff can review and go back and forth with the private schools in order to make sure that we're maximizing what they want. And then for 2 consecutive weeks, this task force, we believe, if we get enough, will review and either approve, not approve, or send back for further consideration the distribution of funds. And the reason that we have to take these all together is that, and Nick brought this up last time, if we don't and go first come, first serve, then it would encourage people to get it in earlier than others, which then creates somewhat of a disadvantage if you're asking for funds and they're already gone. So in this way, if everyone hits the deadline, everyone has the same possibility of getting the funds if indeed we run out. If we don't run out, then that won't matter anyway. And then the board would approve or not approve on April 13th. Let me look at this. This is another same time frame. But let's look at it this way. The week of March 8th through the 12th is essential for the private schools. And I know that Tate invited many of them to be on the YouTube watching today. So this is that week, which is next week, is really critical. The pre-launch of the application, and then Tate and Dean, Doug, and Boston Consulting Group will be walking private schools through a webinar and the application process. That will be recorded, and it's possible that the launch of the application may occur as early as later in the week. We're not saying that here on this timeline, but possibly later in the week. But this week is important because if you walk through the application, you can actually start doing the application on the week of the 8th through the 12th, even if the formal application doesn't launch. Our staff will be doing office hours and all throughout the week, the next week. So these next 2 weeks are pivotal, and also recording sessions so that people that do not formally come in and get questions answered, they can always review any of this on their own time. So I want to be crystal clear as we go through this. The next 2 weeks for the private schools in Kansas are really important. Next week to go over and join in on a webinar on how to fill out the application. And then the following week to make sure that any questions and again, technical assistance, whatever is needed. So those 2 weeks will be heavy on information and technical assistance. The deadline again is the 26th. Once the state board takes action, the information then gets disseminated to all schools at that time, and that they are going to receive the money. You can see the tight time frame that we have to hit because of the federal requirements to do so. I can't say enough. We apologize for this tight time frame. Deeply apologize, and it's not fair, but it's what we're trying to live with as we go forward. So again, let me just reiterate. Next week, webinar, application walkthrough, answer any questions, live and then recorded. People can go back. If that goes as well as we think, it may be possible to release the application even late next week, but certainly no later than Monday. And then all through the following week, our staff will be doing office hours and just dedicating their time to answering questions around the EANS money.
And we have a clarifying question from Melissa Rooker.
Thank you, Jim. Randy, I just want to clarify the 30-day time clock. Does that start from the date the EANS submission is received by the State Department? So I'm looking at this, it would be March 26th, or is it when we launch the process on the 15th?
Thanks, Melissa. I'm going to actually again ask Tate and Dean that question. I believe it's when we received it, but I want to make sure.
The first 30 days is from when we received it, which was February 26th. We have to have the application out within 30 days.
And then the time clock from the time the application goes out until the decisions are made, is that another 30-day window?
The next 30-day window is from when we receive an application. So when we receive that first application, we have to make a decision on it, which, since there's this piece with the poverty and the COVID-19, we really need to be reviewing them all at the same time.
Got it. I would just reiterate the pre-launch week is a process we use at the Children's Cabinet for our early childhood block grant and other grant programs. And we have found it to be very helpful to give the opportunity to review the application ahead of the application window actually opens. So appreciate seeing that mirrored in this process because it's a good amount of time to just iron out some of the questions that the programs might have.
And I've got two other things I want to address here too. I mean, Janet has asked, when's the webinar coming out? Our goal is Wednesday or Thursday of next week. So we hope to have that settled by Monday. We'll be announcing it hopefully by end of business Monday, but we will try to give a minimum 24, if not 48 hours. My second item is I want to come back to Nick's question because our staff has pulled up the law, and unfortunately, how the law is written, I don't know if we have the ability to do what Nick suggested or what we thought we might be able to. Because in the law, it says a non-public school shall be required by the secretary that such non-public school did not and will not apply for and receive a loan under the paragraphs 36 and 37 of the Small Business Act, which would be the PPPs. So we will try to reach out and get more clarification. And I would also encourage you guys to reach out to the Office of Non-Public Education or any other entity to see if they can give us any different guidance. But based on the law, it does not sound like that would be a good option for your schools.
And we have a question from Senator Petty.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, so this was generated from what has just been said a moment ago. Randy Watson had said that possibly the application would be launched prior to the 15th. And then there was information provided that the 30-day window was activated from the time the applications were, or the application was put out. So or at least that's what I heard. So if the application, the launch of the application went out on the 12th, would that then impact, would that, as opposed to the 15th, would that then change that window, that ending deadline time?
It could, but because of where we have the board meetings scheduled, it won't affect it on this timeline.
Thank you.
And a question from Janet Eaton.
So I'll just follow up on, that's really not my question, but now I have a new question. So the crunch of the non-public school timeline is really, Randy, it goes back to what you had first said, it's because of that 13th, 14th board meeting. Because otherwise, the 30 days from the time the application was out till the time the application should be February 26th to March 26th. But that's not the case. We're on a faster timeline, correct?
Correct, because the state board would not meet again until May, Janet.
Okay.
And that puts it too late for approval.
Okay. And then kind of connected back with Nick's question in the Kansas question and answer number 16 is really, I don't think it's possible. And it goes back to the PPP. That's the only reason I'm bringing it up right now. And we can save that till later if you'd rather.
Why don't
Go
we?
ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Janet, with it.
Well, if I'm reading it correctly, the PPP, you can't apply for that after March the 31st. Let's let it be. I think I figured, yeah.
They'll look that up, Janet, and maybe
Okay.
when we get at
Yeah.
a little bit of break, we can take that up again.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Porter, time to go on?
Yes, let's move on.
Okay. So now just kind of flow this on one page. And again, this is public information, so we're violating all the PowerPoint protocol, but it's because these can be used for documents. Weekly KSD communications, non-public, the email list. Of course, our task force meetings are live streamed. We're going to get feedback on the draft application through the task force. Webinar, again, as we talked about in the week of 3/8, to walk through the application, office hours in the following week, and then frequently asked questions will be posted online and updated frequently. We will do everything we can to make sure that every non-public school will have that will help them meet those tight deadlines so that we can get the money to them as needed. So now we'd like to go over the EANS application, the overview of that, and then I'll turn it over to Tate after this section. So we have three key goals for the application, what we're trying to gather for the task force: to ensure compliance under the state and federal law and make sure everyone meets the eligibility criteria, to make and prioritize recommendations across the applications that will be received in EANS, and then support reporting out to the state board, to the broader public, state of Kansas, and to the legislature, how that money was allocated, how it was spent, and the impact of those funds over the course of the lifetime. And that will be true when we get to the ESSER funds too. So those are our three goals for really why the task force and what we're trying to do with the application process. Now, each of these, you know, this is an extremely busy slide, but you'll see here that we're looking for assurances, eligibility, funding needs, what services are you asking, and then the certification statement at the end. And you can see what purpose of the goals that the application itself is trying to hit. We're trying to keep it as short as possible and still make sure that it meets the requirements of the law. And
Do you wanting me to start going through these next parts?
yeah, I think this is your time, isn't it, Tate? I'm
Yep.
intruding on your time, so go ahead, please.
Okay, do you want to unshare and let me share?
We're doing that so Tate can control the screen. I apologize, so thank you. And you might want to go over some of the things I did not, Tate. I apologize.
And are you guys seeing the correct screen on yours?
We're seeing the presenter screen.
Okay.
There we go, I think.
Has yours changed from black?
No, it's
No.
still black.
Okay. Mine's black as well. Let's try. Is that showing up correctly now?
That looks right now.
Super. So just a couple general things to explain, a couple things we've been talking about. Randy mentioned the email. Over the past week, we have created a new email account, which is EANS, EANS @ksd.org. And we've been reaching out in multiple ways to private schools to let them be aware of that and to build a group email account that we can send out one time. So we're more confident everybody's getting the emails they need to get. Plus, we know some people are also probably receiving the emails we send out from 3 to 4 different sources right now. So we've got that in place. Another thing, as the pre-read materials originally came out to you on Wednesday, we also reached out to some of our private schools with the drafts of some of the information we're going to talk about shortly to get their feedback. And their feedback was very helpful. So we've made some adjustments. And that's one of the reasons you got updated materials today. So we just wanted to provide that. You know, Randy's talked through this screen and kind of explained it. I'm going to go into a little more detail than what he'd done on this page because it kind of sets up the next few pages. There's 2 parts to what the application will be. There'll be the part that we'll have that will be completely online. And in the information you received, that was just the question and answers. There are about 6 to 7 pages. Currently, we're working in a Word document, but that will be available hopefully by Tuesday or Wednesday for our webinars. That's why we can't confirm a set date for the webinars yet. And then we'll have an Excel spreadsheet that will explain that piece as well here shortly. But the 5 sections are mainly for things that we either need for reporting, application decision, or in all cases, compliance. And you kind of see based on the purpose there. So we're going to talk about some of these questions, the basics of what's on the checklist, what we mean by funding need, which there'll be 5 questions, which 2 are free response. And we'll have limitations on that, which we'll get into. Services or assistance requested. There'll be a short free response and then the 5 data tables. And that's what will be in the Excel spreadsheet that we'll talk about. And then just a statement of certification. So as we get into more details on those, so you know more of what we're talking about, the basic information insurances are just school name, building number, which this we want to call out because all of our accredited private schools already have building numbers. Many of our non-accredited private schools that qualify already have building numbers, but there are some buildings that may qualify that don't have a building number. And if they don't, we need to encourage them to apply for one, and they can contact me personally or at our eanes@ksd.org. If at the time they're applying, they still have not been assigned building number, they would just need to put pending in there. And we would confirm that they have one, that they're working on getting in place and they've submitted for that, and we'll be able to review their application. We'll have information like the district that their building lies in. We know catchment areas many times is more than one district, but we like to let people know that thinking about the ESSER 1 and where those equitable share participation came in, that would be the district we're looking at, just to give us an idea of what district they're located in for when we're doing reporting, and then the grades served. And then we'll also ask them questions about the learning environment that their schools have been in since March of 2020. You know, we know some of it will be remote for last spring, and then various remote, hybrid, and face-to-face during the 2021 school year. The eligibility will mostly be a checklist just based on the federal EANS eligibility requirements. This will be just the private schools assuring us they meet all of their requirements in the law. The next section, well, the next 2 we'll actually have where most of the work is going to take place for the private schools. The first part, section C, the funding need, they're going to supply us with information like the total enrollment, low income student enrollment, and we've got some different resources for them to decide how to decide their low income student enrollment. It's always preferable to use nutrition if they participate in the nutrition program. If not, there are other options. There's also the option of not putting in low income student enrollment. That would just lower the need based on poverty. They still could qualify, But if it looks like there's too much work to provide the information that's being requested, that would be an option for our private schools. There'll be free response on the other COVID impacts, because that's another piece that we're supposed to take into consideration. So we'll want brief responses of how COVID has specifically impacted the specific school. And then we also have to request any prior public COVID relief funding or services. And we've done a free response here because we know many times by the time these funds get to the actual school, it may not specifically be known of what original source those funds came through. So we're going to be asking our schools to provide a brief response of how they've received other COVID funding, which it may have come through ESSER-1 and the equitable services from the local school district. It could have come from funds through the governor's office in the county or other funds. We just need to have some of that background, or if they received PPP prior to December 27th of 2020. And then section D, we've got 5 bullets here. The first is in the online part of the grant. The last 4 bullets would be part of the Excel spreadsheet. We will need a brief description of how they plan to use these services that will be provided with these funds. Because that's one of the key things is private schools, in most cases, will not receive funds. We'll be talking about the one time they could at the bottom of this section. But mostly they'll be receiving services provided by the state through the service centers across the state of Kansas. In the Excel template, and we'll have a couple slides after this that goes into more detail, but they will request products and services, whether they anticipate the need for full-time or part-time personnel, or new or modified products, services, and requests, and that will make more sense after the next couple slides when we go into more detail. And then there are some things that private schools may be reimbursed for back to March 13th of 2020. And then the last section is just the signature certifying accuracy of information provided. This will be an electronic signature set up in the online application. So we talked about what's called a template, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet. And this is a very basic graphic that will illustrate what these will look like. You know, when we do the trainings, we will actually be pulling up the actual program. And as we walk through them, we will be walking them through the program like we are actually applying for a grant. So this would be similar to the Excel spreadsheet in the grant application. They'll have different parts of the template. You know, we'll need to know what information, so the service ID, and that is for the catalog that we'll be talking about here shortly, because we have some things that we will pre-populate that we know we already have available for use. So that will help with some pre-population. Number 2, for every request, we need a rationale. And this should be a sentence or a phrase at most. And we'll get more into that as well. And then the dollar call amount, if it is not pre-populated, and a lot of things in here, if they're choosing from the menu that we'll talk about, will get pre-populated to assist in their work. So we mentioned the Excel spreadsheet. There'll be 6 tabs. We're showing you the 5 general things that will be in each of the 5 tabs after the introduction and instructions. So the first tab that will need to be filled out will be coming from what we call the service center menu. And we'll give some explanations of specifics of what could be in that on another slide. But we have over 350 items that will be preloaded and possibly more by the time that the application is ready. There'll be resources like coaching and training that would be tied to COVID-19, instructional plan developmental support, the ordering of PPE or other supplies that will help with disease spread, and also things like our technology, which we've mentioned before, and physical barriers. The one thing we always like to remind our private schools of are any equipment will belong to the service center and the states and must be returned to the service center state at the end of this time frame of the program. So we always like to remind people of that item. The second tab will be for the request of full-time personnel. If the private school is looking at possibly, looking at a counselor, teacher, things like that, they would request that in the full-time personnel tab. Very similar for the part-time personnel tab. We're looking more at seasonal or after-school employees for tutoring or summer school. That will be paid at an hourly rate. The fourth tab, and this is really important because I know when we talk about the menu and catalog in tab 1, a lot of people think that's all that can be ordered. That in tab 1 is what we know we already have available from the service centers. We know there could be other things that our private schools need to help address the pandemic and COVID-19. So this is where it will take a little more filling out, because since we don't have the background information of what the cost and the support may look like, there'll be a little more information that the private school would have to provide to us so we could estimate the cost based on the information they provide and what the service would look like. The key, as always, is it would need to tie back to the pandemic. And then the last tab would be if they're requesting something for a reimbursable expense that would go back to March 13th. Some of the keys we remind people on that is, of course, it cannot have already been reimbursed by another federal program, such that we've mentioned before. And we will also have to have documentation, such as paid invoices, materials like that, prior to being able to approve a reimbursement. Those would be the only time that the state or the service center would be allowed to cut a check, an actual check to the private school. So our next slide talks about kind of what does the menu look like. So we have 3 examples of items that are on the menu or catalog from the private schools. This is intended to help simplify the application process for our private schools. But the key is a lot of these things in this catalog are things we believe would be approvable in the right situations. And the key with that is for the private school to use these, they will have to show the impact of COVID-19 and why this would be appropriate in their building. And so the 3 examples are: 1, they might select that they need more cloth face masks because they don't have enough room to social distance and want that for the safety factors. One of the items could be a pack of 20 face masks. The private school would say we need X amount. So let's say they need 5 packs of those, and then we'd have a per pack cost, and it would produce, 5 times whatever the cost is, and everything else would be able to fill in that document for the private school. Another example could be a learning loss webinar provided by ESDAC Service Center. And there'd be a cost per attendee. The private school would just need to select that item and put how many attendees they would expect to be attending that. The third example here is virtual coaching related to the COVID-19 that Southwest Plains could be providing. And again, theirs would be per session. So it would depend on how many sessions that they would like to be granted. And like I said before, right now there's approximately 300 products and there's about 60 services already listed in this catalog that will be pre-populated in the application process. So in the Excel spreadsheet, there's always going to be an area that we ask briefly describe how this request addresses the COVID-19 impact or need. And we really want to, come back to that term briefly. We are expecting a sentence or a short phrase. But on this page, we're talking about some things that we really are going to encourage our schools to do on the left side and things to avoid on the right side. Add the description, one sentence or phrase, very specific, clearly tying it to COVID-19. The things on the right are things that are going to get request rejected. A blank cell, if there's too much information, it could get confusing and leaving out the impact to COVID-19. And we know when we talk about this, sometimes, people need more specific examples, and that's what we have at the bottom to kind of show you what we need. So the example on the left shows you this does not have to be a long answer. The example here talks about needing additional staff for summer school to address the COVID-19 math learning loss. So we know what they're asking for and how they're tying it to COVID-19. The example on the right just talks about purchasing hotspots. It does not say anything about COVID-19, so it could be assumed that we would just like to have hotspots and have them available. It's not really anything having to do with COVID-19. So we really need to emphasize that COVID-19 need for any requests that our private schools are asking for. And I'll go ahead here and take a pause to see if there's any questions.
At this point, I don't see any, Tate.
Okay.
If
Thank
there are
you, Mr.
later, we'll
Ford.
still have the opportunity to ask them.
Yep. So on this page, we wanted to provide some more examples for a product, service, and personnel request. So we have 4 different examples. We've got somebody's requested customized professional development. The description is we are needing 15 workshops for teachers focused on team building and communications. And these are the timeframes we see needing them. So as we review these, we have to decide, is this allowable? Is this reasonable? And is this necessary? Those are the 3 terms that we apply to any federal fund we receive, including these. And so the information provided by the private schools are going to have to confirm, do they have COVID-19 loss that has proved this to be necessary? Is it reasonable? And most of the time we're looking at price cost on that. Can we do something reasonable for $10,000 and the request is for the $30,000 option of that? We also like to talk about reasonable being where if you were asked by somebody in the media, would you be able to defend that cost in this purchase appropriately? So that's kind of what we mean by reasonable. And allocable, is it something that can be purchased with this program? And so for this program, we're looking back at those list of 12 items that Randy talked about in the very first that are allowable items, and it has to tie it back to COVID-19 to become allocable. So when we look at this first one, we've gone through it. This will probably be rejected because it does not tie to the allowable uses. There's nothing about COVID-19 in here. In general, we know we will have staff going to workshops or professional developments or receiving them online. So we don't have enough information to reject. This is just kind of very customized for the certain building, nothing specific. So we'll look at the second one, technology connectivity. So we'd like to purchase internet hotspots to support student remote learning over these periods of 3 years. So when we look at this one, we've got the remote learning. We know that's an issue. Hotspots make sense for helping with that. But will this purchase truly be needed in all these school years? You know, maybe it's for reimbursement for 2021 when there was a lot remote learning going on. But really, do we know or have a good idea in 21, 22 or 22, 23 that this will be a need? So that might be something we look for more clarification from the private schools for. The third one we're thinking is a certified personnel request. And it's to hire hire a remediation teacher to address learning loss among struggling students. For possibly this year, for possible reimbursement, or for summer school coming up this summer. We would probably going to accept this. You know, we're talking about remediation. We've had that learning loss. So there's the COVID-19 part, and it would be definitely acceptable during that time frame. You know, and then the fourth example, another certified personnel request. Hire 10 summer school teachers to teach summer school math for high school students for summer school of 2021. That is not going to be enough information. It may be something that's approvable, but we're going to need more information. We would need the number of students they feel have been impacted, and this could be here. It could also be in the narrative part of their application, because we can't really approve 10 summer school teachers if we don't know how many students we're talking about. You know, if we end up finding out it's 5 students, obviously 10 summer school teachers is too many. But if we're looking at maybe we have 200 students, this could be 20 sections of 10 kids. So that would be more approvable. So these are just, you know, 4 examples of why being precise and tying it to COVID-19, that we're going to be encouraging our private schools to really focus on when they do this.
Okay, we have a question from Nick.
Okay.
Yes, I should have been quicker, but going back to the area of the professional development, does that have to be all through the service centers?
No, it does not. And if you think back when we had a page that had the different places and the different tabs, that would be something that you could put in other.
Okay.
We know what the service centers can provide right now, but we also know there's other vendors out there. And so you can request those, and that's where we're going to need a little more information on approximate cost. And then the service centers could hire those providers for the private schools. So that's a very good question and very allowable.
Okay, the second question I had is, suppose a school is doing a summer academy or a summer school in a different specific areas. And it involves some consumable supplies. Is the consumable supplies counted for reimbursement for that type of a program?
No, those would need to be requested ahead of time. And then the service centers would buy those for you. And one of the keys is, of course, they have to be non-secular as well. But those supplies would need to be purchased ahead of time.
Okay, so ahead of time, meaning before the application is filed or while the application is filed? And keep in mind the time frame we have.
Right. We have a really tight time frame, and that's one of the things why we need to get these approved as quickly as possible. Because once we get them approved, there's going to be things like that we do need to be purchasing as soon as possible.
Okay, and it comes to my third question is through enrollment, and we're obviously our focus is looking at the learning loss and any other student that may have had difficulties during the school year for the disruption. So is it just limited to those type of students, or can it be open if another parent says, I think my child should benefit for this summer school?
The key will be, it'll be students that have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you can confirm or feel confident that yes, that parent is correct, that would be fine.
Okay. Again, Tate, I have no clue what that enrollment's going to be until we advertise that we're doing it. And so that's problematic with getting it onto the application. I have a concern there. Do we just estimate based on our data? Who
Yes.
is going to be affected?
We would encourage you to estimate and probably estimate on the high side. Because if we don't obligate enough money, we can't come back for more money. But if we have to reduce, that is allowable. So if you would request, like in this example, 10 summer school teachers for 200 kids, and it ends up being 8 summer school teachers for 175 kids, we can make that adjustment. It would be very difficult to make the adjustment the other way.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
And Frank, there's a question on Part C funding needs. Frank, go ahead and ask your question.
Tate, as you were talking about the reasonableness of some of the requests, I was just wondering if it would help. My first question is why we're only looking at 1920 enrollment numbers for the schools versus also asking for 2021. I think that would be important, but then also the number of full and part-time staff. When you're looking at, we're asking for 10 summer school teachers, but you only have 5 full-time teachers in the building, that would help. I think that would help you with the reasonableness of the request.
Right. And we appreciate that, Frank. And I don't know if some of our KSD staff are Boston Consulting Group staff, because some of that I know at least at one point has been on the application. And this was just an overview. So some of that may still be on the application. I don't know if Dean, Doug, or Boston Consulting Group could help answer that question.
I'm looking at the draft, page 5 of the draft application that came out with the updated information, and that's not part of what we got sent. So if it is a part of the other one, then that's fine.
Okay. And we'll definitely take note of that. And if it's not in there, it's likely we will add it, at least to the extent that to please respond to those type of questions in the free response. Because you're exactly right. That is going to be an issue for reasonability in the long run.
Okay, I see no other questions. Let's move ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Porter. The next 2 slides we have here are more for what you can expect to see as a task force. After we've got all the applications in, gone through them, sorted them, you're going to get some tables that have some general information. You will also have access to all of the applications as well. But we know time to look through all of them is probably not anywhere near reasonable for the task force members, but you will have access. So we will, after going through all the information, we will provide tables for you with our recommendations. And this is a sample table, and this data is just, fictional data. We've made it up, just use as examples. Also, the table that you will receive will have more columns with greater detail of the request and the recommendations. But you will see a list of each school. You'll see their total number of students. You'll see their low-income students. You'll see an approximate total requested. And this kind of comes back to Nick's question and other questions we've gotten. There's going to be a lot of estimating of cost right now. And that's one of the difficult concerns right now for a lot of people when they request this. And that's kind of why we've, encouraged people to request high, because it's better to request too much than not enough funding for the services. And then what KSD staff is recommending to the task force. So like here, School A has 153 students, 6% low income, $61,000 worth of services were requested. we're recommending 42,526. And we're gonna have in that why this is the amount. Why is there the difference? Our ultimate goal would be everybody requests a certain amount of services and where they're all allowable, and we're able to provide that. But we know realistically that probably won't happen. But our goal would be hopefully sometimes you'd see some of these schools total requested is a certain amount and the total recommended is also that same amount. So
We have
this
a
is kind of
question.
one item that you'll get. Yes.
We have a question from Melissa Rooker.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, thanks, Jim. Tate, I just, remind me that what we award to the private schools is not going to get sent to them. If we gave school A the $42,526 that is being recommended, they're not going to get that in one lump sum from us. They draw down as they use it. Is that correct?
No, your initial idea, none of these funds will go to the
Well,
private schools. The service center will draw down the funds as needed.
as needed. So I guess it relates to, we deal with the same issues in the remote learning grant program that we're supervising at the cabinet. And it's worked out well where there's some measure of estimation that needs to go into the requests that are made, but the fact that it's drawn down as needed is the safeguard, I think, and we can feel good on the task force side that if that summer school example, if there were only 8 teachers needed for that program, they're not getting the money for 10 that what they'll draw down is money for 8 teachers. So I think it gets clarified as we go along.
Yep, that is true, Melissa, and that's a very good point. And that's where, if in Nick's example, they would end up needing more, if someplace else has been underestimated, that's where we might be able to make adjustments, but we just cannot count on that up front. And with that, the service centers will also having to be keeping us updated. They're just not going to be able to draw down. They're going to be telling us what expenses they've had to provide services to the schools, what's occurred so far, and what they need to draw down to make sure they can pay for that at that point. And did we have another question come in?
You're going to catch it the next time around. Go ahead. Next slide.
Okay. And this is another example of a chart or table we're going to be providing to you as a task force that summarizes the reports of the applications and the request and our recommendations. So on this sample, we're saying we had requests for a total of $22 million. So by category, the products that were requested were worth 4 million, the services 5, personnel 10, and reimbursement $3 million. And this just will provide you an overview of how the private school services are being provided in what areas. And then like the chart on the right, to kind of divide it up by what percentage over time are things happening. Like in 2021, this much of the funds will be used. In 2022, this much, and in 2023, this much. And there'll be different ways that we'll be able to provide different summaries to the task force and to the public so they can see how these funds are being used. And this will be very similar to things with ESSER. These are the type of things we will be providing to you guys as a task force so you can make sure that the funds are being used appropriately and for the right things and have a good idea of how they're being used. And again, the data in this is just made up data. So it doesn't mean that we expect personnel to be the biggest cost, but it could be. Same thing with reimbursements. Our reimbursements may only be a few $100,000. They could be 3 million. They could be more. Okay, this would be a good break to take any more questions we have at this point.
let's move on.
Okay. I am going to unshare my screen and Dr. Watson is going to continue from here.
And will we be addressing, Randy, will we be addressing Mike's question?
Sorry. Yes. the
Yes,
answer is
I
yes.
believe so.
Yes, we will. We've been through these slides so much. I thought it was the next slide, but it's not. It's as I went into Tate's area, it's the area that I'm going to share with you as we go forward. So, as we're now going to continue to talk about the review process as we go forward, and in this case, the applications in step 1 will be submitted to us. And then we will do an initial screen. So what you see in the light yellow, dark yellow, or what KSDE will do. We will do an initial screening and we will do an application review. So we get the application and that's what we will do. We'll obviously have back and forth with the schools or the diocese if they're putting them together, a combination, so that we can get a complete application process to you. Steps 4 and 5 are for the task force. Summer reporting, again, as Tate said, and you'll be able to see every application. So you can look at the summary, you can look at every application, and then be ready to either say yes or no or more information. And then as Tate pointed out, the reporting, the allocation of resources in a multitude of ways is for the transparency of the task force, and the State Board of Education will be providing to the public and to anyone that wants it. So again, we're trying to take several consideration things into account. We will need to prioritize the number of applications and the total eligible requests. And that means that that's why we have to align and refine and calibrate once those applications come in. There'll be differentiated needs from various schools. Some schools may have been out of school longer than others. Maybe their social emotional needs are greater in one school. We certainly know we've got poverty needs differently that across the schools. And so that will have a prioritization of the eligibility of those. We are really trying to do everything we can to avoid schools that have great eligible services of not receiving those services. So we're, again, trying to make a process that will do that. And then we have very different sizes schools, from extremely small private schools to very large private schools. And finally, whenever there's an audit that comes, and we need to be clear that how we prioritize the criteria for allocation of funds, that is defensible with the U.S. Department of Ed, especially as it relates to poverty. So specifically, Mike, this gets at your question. So here's internally how we propose prioritizing the EANS funds. And I want to caution you as you look at this chart, and when I go across it, it needs to be read from priority 1, which you're seeing on the screen, to then 2 and 3. So priority 1 is, what is the request and is it an eligible need within the law? Pure and simple. All right. And then a prioritized distribution of those reimbursement services to a differentiated fixed dollar amount for each school. Now, we've got a lot of people. I would guess that our internal staff spent, and the Boston Consulting Group spent as much time debating and discussing this slide as much as anything in this whole document. So obviously only eligible requests for reimbursement can be funded, but you can see that we're looking at possibly a $300 per K-12 student and an additional $1,000 if they're low income. So what that means is a low income student would generate $1,300 per student, and a non-low income student would generate $300. Now that's assuming, that we have more requests than what we have dollars for. But area 3 is the remaining distribution. So let's say that Sacred Heart High School in Salina had a request that was greater than that dollar amount. And Holy Name Elementary School in Coffeyville had a request that was less than that amount. Step 3 could be distribute the balance of the funds among the requests. So what we don't want school districts to think necessarily about that in their application, but this would be a way to prioritize poverty over non-poverty. And I'm going to stop there because I think there's a lot to unpack on this slide, and I know that Tate may want to add, as will maybe our other consultants, on things that I left out. So Tate, is there anything before we go to questions on this slide?
One of the things is we don't know exactly how many private school students we have in the state. We only know those in the accredited schools. So when we've done some approximations with the math, we don't think after steps 1 and 2, we will have all the funds used up. But we want to make sure that any school that has eligible requests that have COVID need, that we can meet some of those needs if at all possible. Because we know we have some private schools that don't have as much poverty as others, but they still have needs. So we want to make sure their eligible requests are made if we have enough funding. But we also know with the poverty students, we know sometimes that creates a lot more need in those schools. And so that's why we expect to have funds available when we get to step 3. And we know the need is different in different schools. We know some schools have received other funding in other ways from other programs. So this is a way that we can definitely prioritize our poverty, but still meet as many eligible requests. And like Randy said before on a slide, if we have private schools that have eligible requests, we're really hoping to be able to address all the schools that legally qualify.
Thanks, Tate. So that
And we have a question from Nick.
Sure. Good. Great.
Nick, you're about to use up your allocation, but I'm going to be
All right.
gracious and let you go anyway.
Just going back to Tate's observation, there are populations across the state, for example, that don't reflect just poverty need, but overall need. And I'm going to point out most private schools are not into ELL services, but there are high populations, and the schools serve them within. So that may be something that a school may want to put it in their narrative. There's one school I know with a very high special ed population. And so that could be a contributing factor also. But maybe someplace on the application in one of those open questions, that can be pointed out from the schools.
Yep. And we always like to point out to also tie that learning loss, because we know those kids in those special populations are more likely to have a bigger learning loss. So really point that out. Compared, because of the pandemic, their learning loss may have been affected differently than other students.
Thank you, Nick.
Janet.
So my question is on this, kind of on the screen that we're on right now, when you talk about distribution of remaining funds, I just would go back one step from that. On the non-public school applications, will the individual school be able to prioritize their requests? Or is that an option for them, I guess, is the question.
Great question, Janet.
Yep.
Tate?
We have talked about that and officially haven't put it in the information, but we do need to. In each tab, it's very easy to prioritize by listing them in order. But as a team, we will talk about if there's a way we can incorporate that into the application. One thing we have talked about is if we receive an application that we cannot provide all the services, that might be a place where we need to reach out. And that would be something that time-wise is difficult, but we would be working with the private schools. And, and if something happened after the fact and they said, you approved us for this for $10,000 and we were thinking it cost 15, could you provide these other services we requested? We would be able to bring that back to the task, that recommendation for the task force if necessary. So we've talked about that. We don't have it worked out well. And the one thing I want to say, we want to be as flexible as the law will allow us. And we know you guys want us to be as flexible as possible. And so we're going to try to do everything to make this happen as best we can to serve the needs. And that's where there's going to be a lot more communication, we know. And I don't know if anybody else on our team has any more they want to share with that, but that is something we are well aware of and trying to find out ways to make it work the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tate.
That's all I see. Let's move ahead.
Okay, so that, as we said, the bulk of today was about EANS. And you can see, and I started by saying when we started 8 minutes early, Mr. Porter, at just slightly after 3 o'clock, this was a heavy lift with a lot of heavy material. But it's important because it lays out the process and the product that we're working for to start having webinars and pre-release next week. So the remainder is a little bit about the ESSER timeline and the review process that will start with it. So this is the chart that you saw earlier when we were talking about EANS. In this case, we're going to talk about ESSER. So next week, we will do the same process that we did today on the ESSER funds so that you have a good knowledge. And so the process that we went through today will be the same. The product that you'll see next week will be different because, as I laid out, the law is different for both. We will launch the application on March 17th, and they will be available for submission. And then we will start reviewing those on a rolling basis and improved in monthly state board meetings. Remember, the ESSER funds are less time sensitive. There's up to a year. And so we might start to be receiving those as early as maybe the 26th of March. We'll see, probably not likely. We probably aren't going to take any of those on the 2nd or 9th unless for some reason it's really time sensitive. But then starting on the 16th, we would start then handling really ESSER funds, and those could start to be drawn down. So I just wanted to kind of lay that out. This chart is the same for both EANS and the ESSER money. So again, a few things around the ESSER timeline as we mentioned. There will be a launch with a webinar and then office hours, but they'll be the weeks following what we saw with EANS. And then again, ESSER a little bit different. We're going to screen those applications on a first come, first serve. And the reason for that is the school districts already have the allocation of the money, unlike on the Eanes side, and all we have to do is approve the use of that. And then again, KSD will share those with the task force on Wednesdays as a pre-read for our Friday meetings. And then the task force, we think, will start receiving the bulk of those on April 16th, even though we may have some as early as the last week in March. The process going to look very much the same on the ESSER side. Again, we'll get an application in. What will KSDE do? We'll screen them. We'll review the application. We'll contact school districts back, correct what we need to, and then what will the task force do? You'll determine whether those requests have been done appropriately to the law. You'll have some recommendations of approving the plan or send the plan back. And then, of course, we'll also have reporting, just like we had on the Eanes side. Mr. Porter, you threw a heavy challenge down 8 minutes early. You know, I'd like to say I just doubled you down, I think, by about 33 minutes. Not counting, though. We're not counting time. But a big lift. Again, next week, big lift on the ESSER side. But we are focused right now, really, internally. And I can't tell you, Tate and Doug and Dean and the Boston Consulting Group are literally yeoman's work in helping the private schools. And Janet and Nick, this is such a huge lift on all the private school part. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that we service the private schools and we get every application that wants to get in, and every eligible expense we hope is fully funded. So, Mr. Porter, I think our staff would be happy to answer any questions or go skipping outside in the nice weather, whatever you would like.
Okay, two things. I want to remind people that we're getting through a little earlier this time and last time, and the department promised you that we'd always be through by 5 o'clock, but looking at the schedule for the 2nd and 9th of April, I'm not making the same guarantee. I did have a private question, and I think we've answered this before, but I don't remember the answer. And that is why? Can you tell us why the service centers were chosen as the vehicle to manage the funds for the private schools?
Yes. So I'm going to lean on Brad a little bit. Let me give you a little bit of an overview. In every other aspect of when federal money has flowed to public and private schools, it's flowed to the school district, and Senator Dietrich will remember this, and then the school district worked on the services within that school district to service the private schools. This process is different. And so, Brad, do you want to speak to why the service centers?
Yes, thanks, Randy. It's a good question, Mr. Porter. We reached out to the service centers, one, because they already have a relationship with many of the private schools and already provide services for them. And secondly, they have the staff, they have the resources. So instead of us trying to, instead of Tate, Doug, and Dean trying to do all this, so anyway, but it really hinged around when we visited with service center directors. Many of them already have that relationship and provide services, so it made sense to work through them.
Thank you. And we had a question earlier that I was asked about when it comes time to review all of these applications, is there staff available? And I assume that that's going to be a major responsibility of the consulting group.
Yes.
Is that a correct assumption?
Combination of both. Combination of both, our staff and the consulting group.
And we have a question from Janet.
So I'm interested in the 300 plus items of when we'll be able to see some of those items. I know we can add to that or suggest others, but it would be helpful to have that sooner than later.
We are hoping for Monday or Tuesday, but at the very latest, it will be when we do the webinar. So it will be next week. We can get it out to you earlier. We're reviewing a draft copy this weekend.
And can today's PowerPoints be available to the members of the task force or the public?
Both, and I think Michaela, I think they were distributed. And Bert, I've been trying to drop that in the chat, and it just looks at me like I'm silly, which means I'm again zoomed out, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I used to be able to do that, but the answer is yes, if it hasn't been done so already, and they will be public-facing documents on our website.
And Jason.
Yeah, I have being a board member, if we're affiliated with a school district and our school district submits an application, will we have to recuse ourselves from the final vote, or can we vote along with everybody? Is there conflict of interest, that type of thing?
Let me give you an example. When I became a member of the State Board of Education, I was still a school superintendent for 6 months. And during that time, I recused myself. There was only one thing that came up, and it was part of a consent agenda. But I recused myself, and that's the way I would approach it. But I think that's up to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
And yeah, Adam reminded we have the PowerPoints already that were sent to us, but we want to make sure they can be available to the public. Mike.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to say thank you to Randy and all the staff at KSD. There's a lot of, to say legwork, there's more than legwork here, and you guys have done a wonderful job. And State Board of Ed, we appreciate that, and I appreciated the formula, so to speak, so that that money is spread out the best we can, because everybody was affected. And so I really appreciate the thought that went into that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And for the public that's watching on YouTube, if you want to know where are all these materials, go to ksde.org and click on Commissioner. And on that page, you'll see the task force. And there's every material. And you can go back on a Saturday night and watch the video again, because it's riveting. And I'm sure all of you will want to do that. But ksd.org, click on the Commissioner's page, and it's right there. And we'll continue to put all the documents there.
And if that's the way you're going to spend your Friday evenings, we're going to try to use some COVID-related funds to provide counseling to you as individuals.
I did have one question come to me privately that I would like to address the whole task force. You know, we've had a lot of questions about staff that will be hired. At this point, we're looking at any type of full-time staff, such as a teacher for the school year that we might hire for the private schools. We are looking at getting the wages from the salary schedule that would be consistent with that building at the private school. And for seasonal staff, such as summer school, after school tutoring, we're looking at a state set wage. And we've been looking at those averages across the state. So we will most likely set the part-time staffing at a wage across the state and work locally with the private schools for hiring any full-time staff during the school year.
Thank you. And I will add to what Mike Augerbach said, and thank you all for your work. Thank you all for participating. And I'll look forward to seeing all of you again at 3 o'clock next Friday afternoon. We are adjourned.
Thank you, Jim.
Jaren,
Thank you, Randy.
thanks everyone.